To talk about the top 3 arguments made by skeptics that extraterrestrials are not visiting Earth. And we'll start from at number 3. They say that the government would be unable to maintain a cover-up for all these years. Well, I have some news for these people. The government has been maintaining a cover-up, but there has been some cracks in that cover-up every now and then. We can't list all of them, but we can go through some of them. Now, in 1950, there was Wilbert Smith. He was a Canadian official from Canada who inquired about UFOs, and there was a top-secret memo that was declassified decades later, and that memo read, I made discreet inquiries of the Canadian Embassy in Washington and obtained the following information about flying saucers. 1. The subject is the most classified in the United States, even more so than the H-bomb. 2. Flying saucers exist. 3. Their modus operandi is as yet unknown, but there's a small group working under Dr. Vannevar Bush. And 4. The entire subject is considered of enormous significance by the United States authorities. Okay, that was, there's been some United States generals over the years. Nathan Twining, for instance, wrote a report about these, saying the objects are not fictitious. There's a lot of evidence. In 1980, there was a group of different American military officials that talked about an incident that happened in Rendlesham. They were stationed in England, and they talked about seeing this unearthly UFO sighting and landing, and one of them saw an alien in Rendlesham Forest in England. There's been lots of things in Roswell. The Roswell incident, there was many people, including Jesse Marcel, who was a top intelligence official at Roswell in 1947. He talked about that there was a cover-up, and so there's been some cracks in this. It's just that no actual official from, like a president ever stepped forward and said, yeah, we're being visited by extraterrestrials. But there has been cracks in the cover-up. Walter Haut, who was the guy who sent out the initial press release that in 1947 that a flying saucer had crashed, that was recovered by the Army Air Forces near Roswell. Years later, a few years before he died, he wrote an affidavit, signed an affidavit where he told the story, admitted things that he never admitted in life. He wanted to wait till after he died because he was told basically to keep a secret. And he talked about this affidavit. He wrote that he actually saw the beings. Not only did something crash, he saw dead bodies. There's been lots of cracks in the government cover-up, but they've been maintaining the cover-up, and they've been doing a good job of it. Yes, they can do it, and they've been doing it, but there are cracks every now and then. So that's a completely bogus argument. The second argument, number 2, is they say that you cannot get here from there. Like they talk about, our science tells us that there's absolutely no way that that these beings could travel millions and millions of light years through space to get to Earth. Well, scientists have been wrong about this kind of stuff before. They're wrong throughout history. The late Stanton Friedman, a nuclear physicist who believed that we were being visited by extraterrestrials, he wrote a book called Flying Saucers in Science. And he pointed out on page 60 of this book that In 1903, Dr. Simon Newcomb, one of the top American astronomers of the 19th century, published a paper in which he showed that flight by man using anything other than a balloon, a lighter-than-air vehicle, was impossible. His paper clearly showed that he knew much less about flight than he did two bicycle mechanics named Wilbur and Orville Wright, who first flew a heavier-than-air vehicle at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina on December 17th, 1903, less than 3 months after Newcomb's article was published. When notified about this historic event, he, similar to many others, had trouble believing that such a flight had occurred. There were no TV or radio reporters back then. He also claimed that, although perhaps a pilot had flown a heavier-than-air vehicle, it would certainly never carry any passengers. He knew nothing about the lift over a wing, about relatively lightweight engines driving a propeller, and all the other engineering aspects of flight that the Wright brothers had investigated in a systematic fashion. So, see, scientists over years have proved themselves wrong over and over, time and time again. Okay? Just because our physics, knowledge of physics at this time, of the physical sciences doesn't specifically allow for travel through, faster than light or close to the speed of light, even though that seems impossible, right? At this point, we're not that far. I mean, look at the advances that we've had in the last 100 years. I've talked about this before. How do we know these scientists could be wrong, right? They obviously are wrong because there are things coming here. There's no question that there are things coming here. So they obviously figured out some way to do it. Maybe they could bend space. There's been talk about going through wormholes. Who knows? Science that we just don't understand yet, right? We haven't figured it out yet. We're just not that far advanced yet. So obviously they're coming here, so they have to, right? So that's one of the arguments. That's totally ridiculous argument, and it just falls flat on its face every time. The number one, okay, there's no evidence. This is the best one. Now, in addition to all the pictures that have been taken over the years of these objects, the film, video, just people who saw it without taking any film, all the reports, military pilots. There's been so many different. There's so much evidence out there. And in addition to that, there is actually some physical evidence that, for instance, in 1964 in New Mexico, when a police officer, Lonnie Zamora, saw this thing landing outside of Socorro, New Mexico, an object that was landed there, and he didn't know what it looked. It was like an egg-shaped object with 3 legs sitting there, and there was these little guys walking around it. And then one of the guys saw him, and they got into this ship, and it took off, blasted off right in front of them. And there was evidence left behind. People that investigated it, Project Blue Book investigated it. The science advisor for the government's Project Blue Book, J. Allen Hynek at the time, he investigated. There were marks left in the ground. Right, the sand was singed. The vegetation was singed. There were little footprints from these little men in the ground. 1994 in Zimbabwe, Africa, there were over 40 school kids out on a recess, and a flying saucer landed near the school, and an alien being came out and communicated with them telepathically. Then it got back in the spaceship and took off. There was over 40 little kids, and they all talked about it. They were all interviewed. That's not proof. That's no evidence. That doesn't count. There's been objects removed from people that were people who have claimed to been abducted by aliens. Objects removed from them by the late Roger Lear, Dr. Roger Lear, a surgeon who was investigating. He did it 17 times, 17 different surgeries, pulled out these objects that were embedded in people that they don't know how these objects got there. No strange objects that had nanotechnology and had. Some experts looked at these objects and they had isotope ratios that couldn't have originated from this solar system. There's lots of evidence out there. It's happening all the time. People are seeing these things all the time. But to say that there's no, or there's no evidence, how come we don't? How come one doesn't land on the White House lawn? Like a lot of people in their minds, a lot of these debunkers and skeptics, they think, well, they would present themselves to us. Well, what are you talking about? What makes you think that? Because you saw a 1950s movie, Day the Earth Stood Still, with the thing basically landed in Washington, D.C. Take me to your leader. That's what they expect. It's ridiculous. Their notion of how it should go down. Because nothing goes along with what they believe should happen, they just dismiss it. Okay? There's plenty of evidence out there. Plenty of evidence. I mean, all the pictures that have been taken, and the pictures that were taken and film that was taken at a time before we had anything near CGI. There's been film that the government actually looked at and had no explanation for it back in the 50s. A lot of people are like right now look at this and say, oh, this started in 2000. This has only been going on since 2004 with the David Fravor Tic Tac incident. This has been going on since at least 1947. And probably centuries before that. We just didn't start noticing it till 47. But there's plenty of evidence out there. All these people out there that had different sorts of experiences, from seeing landed craft to being abducted to seeing the things flying, right? There is evidence. I saw one of these things with my own eyeballs in 1994. I know that there was no way that this could have been manufactured by humankind. There's tons of evidence out there. They just turned their back to it. They don't want to look at it. Luckily, we do have some scientists now that are they're changing that. They're finally, because of the Pentagon coming out, it seems like the stigma is starting to fade a little bit. So now they're not too afraid to put themselves out on a limb and investigate these things, like we talked about in recent podcasts, like Avi Loeb from Harvard. There's a lot of people out there that are looking into this. But yes, there's evidence, and they don't want to admit that there's evidence, but there is evidence, and they can't debunk it. They're just unable to debunk it because there's obviously something going on here. They're obviously here, and it's time for people to start recognizing this, and let's get to the bottom of it, and hopefully let's have some full disclosure, not just a little bit.